Ever feel like, you should have a bit more of a direct say in the big decisions, beyond just voting every few years?
I know what you mean.
Well, get ready, because today we're really diving deep into a topic that takes that idea to a whole new level. We're talking referendums in Europe.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and we're basing this deep dive on a fascinating recommendation, actually, from way back in 2005.
Okay.
It was put out by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. You familiar with them?
I am, yeah. They're like the guardians of democracy across all of Europe.
Exactly. Kind of like, I guess, a broader version of the EU Parliament.
That's a great way to put it. And their recommendation really gets into the nitty-gritty of making referendums work well all across Europe.
So for anyone who maybe, slept through that week in civics class, what exactly is a referendum?
Basically, it's a chance for citizens to vote directly on one specific issue, whether it's a new law, a change to their constitution, or even something like joining a bigger organization.
Right, like when we see those big votes about like EU membership and things like that.
Exactly.
And this report, it points out that those kinds of referendums have actually been on the rise in Europe, especially since like the 1970s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They found a really interesting stat. Between 1972 and 2003, get this, there were 41 national referendums just on EU integration alone.
Wow, that's a lot.
It's a lot. So what's driving this whole trend, towards more direct democracy?
Well, it's actually a whole bunch of different things all coming together. So you had the fall of the Berlin Wall back in '89, right?
Right.
And that kind of triggered a wave of all these constitutional changes in Eastern Europe. And a lot of those actually ended up going to a public vote.
Interesting. So like a referendum to kind of solidify those changes.
Exactly. And then at the same time, you also have this like constantly changing landscape of the European Union itself.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see how that plays out.
Every new treaty or expansion, they're often asking their citizens to directly weigh in.
So it's about more than just asking yes or no at that point. It's about how these referendums kind of shape the whole relationship between citizens and the EU over time.
Exactly. And that actually gets to the core of this whole debate about direct democracy versus representative democracy.
Right. The age-old question.
Like, should citizens be voting on everything themselves directly, or, should they be electing officials to make those tough decisions for them?
Right, finding that balance. So where does this parliamentary assembly land on that? Are they like all in on this super direct approach?
They're actually very clear that they see referendums as a way to make democracy even stronger, not to like get rid of parliaments or anything like that.
Okay.
They see these referendums as a really powerful tool. They can boost legitimacy, they can increase accountability, and most importantly, they can get citizens way more involved in the decisions that actually affect their lives.
So it's more about making sure those referendums are working with elected officials, not necessarily like taking over for them completely.
Right.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But there is this one phrase that kept popping up in the report: good practices.
Right.
What do they mean by that?
Well, it's really important to remember that referendums, they aren't some kind of like magical solution.
Right, because on the surface they sound like it, maybe.
Right. But the report actually warns that if referendums are not done well, they can actually be misused.
Oh, okay.
And that misuse, it could even undermine the very principles of democracy that these referendums are supposed to be upholding.
Okay, now you've got me a little bit nervous. What kind of misuse are we talking about here?
Okay, so imagine, for example, a government, and they're trying to completely bypass their own parliament on a really controversial issue.
Okay.
So instead of going through that normal process, the debates and votes and all that, they just say, let's put it to a referendum.
Oh, I see. So kind of sidestepping the process of it.
Exactly. Or another example, think about a referendum campaign, but it's just full of misinformation.
So people are voting without really having all the facts.
Right. They're swayed by misleading stuff, maybe even outright false claims. And these are the kinds of pitfalls that the assembly, they're really trying to prevent.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's like with any powerful tool, right?
Exactly.
You can use it for good, or you can use it, well, not for good. It just depends on, the people in charge, their intentions. So how does the Council of Europe recommend that we make sure referendums are being used the right way, responsibly?
Well, this is where they actually get really hands-on.
Okay.
They want to create very clear guidelines for all of their member states, share the best practices, for designing and actually running a referendum, and then they'll even offer practical help to any country that wants to get it right. So they're not just pointing out the problems. They really want to be part of the solution.
That's good, being proactive. And they're not exactly starting from scratch either, right?
Yeah.
Didn't you say that they already have some guidelines in place?
You're right. They've already put together guidelines for local and constitutional referendums. But what I think is exciting is that they're thinking much bigger picture now. They're asking, how do we make sure that referendums at all levels of government really strengthen democracy? Local, regional, national, how do we make them all work?
That's a great goal. But of course, we can't forget about the most important part of this whole equation, right?
And what's that?
The voters themselves.
Of course, the voters.
What does the Assembly say about making sure those voters are informed, that they're engaged, especially when it comes to something as important as a referendum?
So there are two really key things they emphasize. First, they say voters need, clear and impartial information about, whatever the issue is.
That makes sense.
Imagine if you had, a really well-researched, completely unbiased article explaining it, and that was available to every single person.
Right, like a voter's guide, but, super in-depth.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So they can make a decision that's actually informed.
Makes sense. What's the second thing?
Okay, so the second one, it's even more, I guess you could say, fundamental. The Assembly says that citizens really need a good, solid understanding of how the whole democratic process works in the first place.
Okay, so, beyond just the issue on the ballot?
Right. How do these referendums even work? What impact do they really have? How does, my single vote fit into all of this? It's about getting people to that, deeper level of civic knowledge, Yeah,
you're not just, passively checking a box. You understand the mechanism.
Yeah, exactly. You're an active participant.
You're an active participant. I like that. And the Assembly, they've got some pretty bold ideas about how to make that happen, judging by the report.
Oh, yeah, they do. There were two proposals that really jumped out at me.
Okay, hit me with them. What are we thinking?
Okay, so the first one, it's about voting rights. The Assembly actually suggests that maybe we should give legal immigrants the right to vote in these local referendums.
Interesting.
And they're building this off of, there are already some places doing this for local elections.
That makes sense, though. If you're directly affected by these decisions being made at a local level,
You should have a say, right?
you should get a say, yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
What's the second radical proposal?
Okay, so this one is even more, I think, radical in a way.
Mm-hmm.
They're suggesting that we should think about expanding these referendums to basically every single level of government.
Wow, okay.
Local, regional, national, you name it.
So you could have a local referendum about a new park, a regional referendum about transportation, a
Yes.
national referendum about some massive social issue.
Exactly.
I mean, the possibility is, it really gets you thinking.
It does, right? It makes you think, what could that look like? And of course, it would come with its own, complexities.
I was just going to say, I'm sure there would be a lot of challenges with something like that.
Absolutely. But, that's what's so interesting about democracy. It's always changing. It's adapting. It's trying to find new ways to reflect what people actually want. And the Assembly really seems to think that these referendums, they're a key part of that whole process of, evolution.
It makes you think, how different would those EU parliamentary elections feel if you knew that down the line you might actually get to directly weigh in on a specific issue?
Exactly.
It wouldn't just be well, I voted for that person and now they make all the decision.
Right, you have more of a direct connection. And think about the impact. What if there was a union-wide referendum on, climate change or migration rules or even the future of the euro?
Okay, see, now that is mind-blowing to me. We were just talking about giving citizens more, say, at a local level, but a union-wide referendum on, climate change.
It seems almost futuristic,
It does.
doesn't it?
Yeah, but here we are, this document from 2005 is suggesting just that. It really makes you wonder what's in store for democracy in the 21st century.
I know.
As technology gets even more advanced, as we're all more interconnected, who knows what new ways we'll find for people to actually participate in their governments.
Right. And it makes you think, were there already things in the works back then? Was this a trial balloon they were floating?
That's what I love about these deep dives, We're not just here's a summary. It's let's look at these big what-if questions.
Exactly.
And speaking of what if, I can't imagine the Assembly would throw something like a union-wide referendum out there without thinking about what that would actually look like.
Yeah, you're totally right. And they definitely save their most, I don't know, I guess you could say thought-provoking idea for the very end.
Okay.
In their recommendation, they actually call for the European Union to, seriously think about. Are you ready for this?
Yeah, hit me.
A union-wide referendum.
Wait, are you being serious right now?
So,
A referendum with all 27, well, I guess more than that now, like all the EU states?
I know.
Hundreds of millions of people voting on one thing. Logistically, I can't even imagine.
It would be, wouldn't it? It's like, how do you even...
It's a whole thing.
It's huge. But, I mean, it's kind of a captivating idea when you really...
It's captivating. Okay, so let's say, hypothetically, they figure out the logistics. What are the benefits? What are the, like, upsides of a union-wide referendum?
Well, I think the biggest one is it would give, everyday Europeans a direct say on stuff that affects, all of Europe.
Right. It's not just like, oh, this is a Spain problem or this is an Italy thing. It's like, this affects us all.
Exactly. Like the things we were talking about before. Climate change, migration, the future of the euro. Like, these are not small, contained issues.
These are the big ones.
Exactly. The ones that need a response from everybody.
Yeah. So, I mean, it would definitely make people feel like their voices are heard, like they actually have a say in how the EU moves forward, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
I think it could be huge for building a sense of, like, shared identity. Like we're all Europeans together.
European solidarity.
Exactly.
And potentially lead to, like, more unified policies.
Exactly. If everybody's on board because they had a chance to actually vote on it.
Yeah. Right. It's not just, like, some people dragging their feet.
Exactly. But, it's not all like sunshine and roses, right?
Right. Okay, so downsides, potential problems, we've got logistics. What else?
Well, I mean, I think a big concern is, with something on this scale, the potential for misinformation, for manipulation.
Yeah, we were talking about that with just like regular referendums, but this is like next level.
Right. It's a whole other beast. Making sure that people had access to like good information, accurate and unbiased, that would be like the biggest thing.
Otherwise, you just have people voting based on like fear or whatever they saw on,
Exactly.
whispering the internet.
Exactly.
Which is always dangerous. Okay. Other concerns, other things to think about.
I think the other big one is like representation. Making sure, because you always have a risk in a democracy, right? The tyranny of the majority.
Right. So explain that a little bit. Like, what do we mean by that?
So if you have a system where it's just like whatever the most people want, that's what happens, then the rights of smaller groups, minorities,
you get trampled on.
Exactly. They get left behind. And, the EU is so huge and diverse.
So many different perspectives.
Exactly. So figuring out how to make sure that everybody's interests are protected, no matter how big or small that group is or what their, political leanings might be, that would be absolutely crucial.
Yeah. So it's like high risk, high reward potentially.
Yes.
High reward, but like a lot of really, really careful thought would have to go into this.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the Assembly, in this recommendation, they lay out both sides, right?
Yeah, they're not like pushing for it. They're just like...
They're just saying, hey, this is something to consider.
Think about it. Yeah, don't just like do it tomorrow.
Exactly. But definitely start thinking about it now because, I mean, these things take time.
They do, yeah. This has been a fascinating conversation, though. It's so interesting to think about all of the different ways that democracy can, play out, that it can evolve.
Well, no, it's an ongoing experiment.
Right.
Totally.
We're all just trying to figure it out as we go along.
We are figuring it out together, hopefully.
Hopefully.
Yes. Well, on that note, I think we've given our listeners plenty to mull over.
Yes, definitely.
To think about, to maybe spark some conversations of their own.
For sure.
So if you've enjoyed this deep dive into the world of referendums, make sure to check out the show notes. We'll have links to the original Council of Europe recommendation, plus some other great resources if you want to learn even more. And as always, thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.